Welcome back. We're off to the war in Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces. Some call it a warning or ultimatum. But the IDF says its forces will expand military operation in Rafah if hostages held by Hamas are not released by March 10th. It was echoed by Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz, making it the first time Israel has ever announced when its troops would stage an invasion into Gaza's southern city. Israel has said its plans to expand its ground operations into Rafah as part of its goal to destroy Hamas after the October 7 attacks. But there's growing concern that the roughly 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering there will have nowhere to go, as comes as the International Court of Justice holds historic hearings into Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories since 1967. And as an Israeli assault on the southern Palestinian city of Rafah looms, Egypt's Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry says his country is not drawing up any contingency plans in case of an influx of Palestinian refugees. Speaking at a panel of the Munich Security Conference, Mr. Shoukry denied such plan. Egypt's Sinai Peninsula borders the city of Rafah. Egypt has repeatedly warned against the forced displacement of Palestinian civilians. 5 months into the war, Mr. Shoukry has reiterated Cairo's stance of not intending to provide any safe areas or facilities. Israel's military offensive first targeted the north of Gaza Strip, forcing over 1 million Palestinians to flee south. The operation has since expanded, and the next stage appears to be Rafah. Israel said it would work to develop a plan to evacuate civilians in Rafah, but it's yet to make that public.
We will not deal with the hypothetical, and we will continue to call upon all our friends, all of those who understand the complexities and the dangers associated with it, to not only provide support by rhetoric, but to indicate clearly that there will be consequences for any form of displacement. It is not our intention to provide any safe areas or facilities, but necessarily, if this was a case and a situation, we will deal with the humanity that is necessary, and we will provide the support to the innocent civilians if that was to take place. But that should not be construed as an encouragement or an acceptance for an eventuality of this nature.
The VOA's Linda Gradstein is in Israel for us. Linda, I have so many questions from just what I've read, but let's begin with the deadline to this offensive ending in Rafah. Why is there a deadline for Rafah but not for the rest of Gaza?
Well, first of all, it's for the beginning of the operation. March 10th is the first day of Ramadan, the Muslim holy month. So I think there's a sense also that Israel is trying to pressure Hamas to release the remaining hostages. There are over 100 hostages still being held in Gaza. And as time goes by, there is fear that many of them, or some of them at least, may not be alive. Of those 105, about 30 have been pronounced dead by Israel, and Hamas is holding their bodies. So I think it's primarily a way of pressuring Hamas and perhaps pressuring the Palestinian people to try to get them to pressure Hamas to release the hostages. I am not convinced that Israel will launch an operation against Rafah. You've got 1.5 million Palestinians who have been driven from other parts of Gaza and are now in Rafah. So you would have to move 1.5 million people. That's what you were just talking about, before I came on. So it's a very complex operation. There's going to be a lot of resistance, a lot of criticism by the international community. So I think it's primarily a way of pressuring Hamas.
Yes, over 1 million people. A lot will go into moving them into any safe cities. And right now we can't identify any safe cities in Gaza because of the war and because of Hamas' presence there. But you did hear the Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry say that Egypt has no plans, of taking in Palestinian refugees. Just wondering what the Israeli government feels about this and how it feels about, these Arab countries not taking in any refugees, not offering to take in any refugees from Gaza.
Well, Israel says that the Palestinian people is the only people that 75 years after the creation of the State of Israel, that there are still refugees. And, Israel has wanted the Arab countries to take in refugees. I think Egypt is concerned. Rafah is very close to the Egyptian border. And as you just said, there's more than 1 million Palestinians living now in Rafah, in tent cities, under very difficult conditions. And Egypt does not want 1 million poor people who have been, dependent on United Nations aid for all of these years coming into Egypt and demanding citizenship. I think there's also some fear of Hamas in Egypt. Apparently the Hamas leadership is also in Rafah, or in the tunnels underneath Rafah, to be more exact. So Egypt is concerned that, Israel will, they say it's Israel's problem to solve. Israel went into Gaza. Of course, it was after the Hamas attack of October 7th, but they're saying, Egypt is saying, why should we bear the burden of basically things that Hamas and Israel have done?
It really makes no sense, Linda. The fact that Egypt acknowledges Hamas is a terrorist group, they are afraid of it. So are the other Arab countries also afraid of Hamas appearing in their countries and also causing problems. But here they leave Israel to carry the burden of eliminating Hamas. The IDF, however, is confident of hitting, just asking if the IDF is confident, of hitting all of Hamas's stronghold in Gaza. They're living in tunnels right now. So how difficult is this operation going to be in Rafah and for the rest of Gaza?
Well, the war has now been going on 4.5 months. And the fact that the Israeli army, which is, one of the strongest armies in the world, has not been able to conclusively defeat Hamas shows how difficult and complicated this is. Now, Israel has scored a lot of successes against Hamas. It has blown up hundreds of tunnel entrances. They say that there are hundreds of miles of tunnels built underground. Israel has, though, so far failed. There are, sort of 5 senior Hamas leaders, and it's assassinated only one of them. I think Israel is confident that eventually it can win the battle against Hamas, although some Palestinians say Hamas is an idea as much as a terrorist group. And that, this idea, it's, being seen by some Palestinians as heroes, as the ones who were standing up to Israel, as the ones who came into Israel, crossed the border, murdered 1,200 Israelis. So polls, at least in the, until now, have actually shown an increase in support for Hamas in the West Bank. That said, Israel is also trying to, it says, limit the number of Palestinian civilians killed. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, which is affiliated with Hamas, the death toll has now crossed 29,000 people killed in Gaza since the beginning of the war. Now, Hamas, they don't distinguish between fighters and civilians. Hamas says 6,000 fighters have been killed. Israel says the number is more like 10,000. But in any case, you're talking about thousands and thousands of Palestinian civilians being killed.
I just wanted to make reference to the video that my producer just put up. And I suppose that they are videos of pro-Palestinian demonstrators outside of Palestine, outside of Israel. And we've seen these protests around the world. People are calling for Israel to free Palestine and so on. How does the Israeli government feel about the fact that people are asking for freedom of Palestine, but not talking about the presence of Hamas, which is a militant group that has kept the Palestinian people under some sort of bondage in Gaza and have done nothing to benefit the lives of the people?
Well, first of all, the pictures you're showing now are demonstrations to free the hostages, not to free Palestinian prisoners.
Right.
And, for Israelis, there's an entire area in the center of Tel Aviv that's been renamed Hostage Square, in which there are, constantly family members of the hostages. Israel's a very small country, so everybody knows at least one person who has been taken hostage, and the families have been extremely outspoken and constantly advocating for the freedom of their of their relatives, and that's what we're looking at now. In terms of the pro-Palestinian protests that have been seen around the world, I think that Israel feels that it's Palestinian propaganda, but I think that sort of the image of Israel in the world has changed. And on October 7th, if Israel was the victim of Hamas, by the way, that picture we're looking at now was Kfir Bibas, who was the youngest hostage. He was kidnapped at 10 months. He's now over a year old. And Hamas says that he and his parents and his older brother were killed in captivity. And in fact, today, for the first time, Israel released some footage it found in Gaza of their kidnapping and of them in Gaza a couple of days after their kidnapping, and says that they are very worried about their, whether or not they're alive. I think that Israel realizes that it will have to release Palestinian prisoners. And that's one of, there are still indirect negotiations going on for a hostage deal that would include a ceasefire, more humanitarian aid into Gaza, and the release of Palestinian prisoners. Hamas is demanding the release of many prisoners who have killed Israelis. In the first prisoner exchange and ceasefire in November, none of the prisoners released had killed Israelis. But in this one, you're talking about releasing Israeli soldiers. They're some of the captives, so the price is going to be much higher. So I think that Israel is trying very hard to carry out a diplomatic effort as well as a military effort. But I think they're kind of focusing more on the military effort, and they kind of say, well, if the world is mad at us, that's their problem. They are, of course, very concerned about what the United States, specifically President Biden, has to say.
Yes, Linda. Has the Israeli Prime Minister ever talked about, what happens in post-war Gaza?
Well, Netanyahu has consistently refused to talk about what happens in post-war Gaza. I mean, I personally think it's a mistake because it has to be talked about, and that Netanyahu is being criticized by many in his government for that. But he says that Israel needs to focus on total victory. He said it again today. And what's happening now is that Israel really has two goals. One is freedom of the hostages, and the other is victory over Hamas. And what seems to be happening is that those two goals are kind of clashing. The United States is laying out a plan as the international community that involves a sort of grand bargain in which there would be a demilitarized Palestinian state in the 1967 borders, meaning the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Israel would get normalization with Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis would get a defense pact with the United States. It seems unlikely under this government that Netanyahu is currently heading, which includes some radical extremists, that they would ever agree to this. There is some talk that perhaps Netanyahu could replace these radical extremists with more moderates like Benny Gantz, who we spoke about early in the interview, and Yair Lapid, the head of the opposition, and that you could have a center-left to center-right government headed by Netanyahu that perhaps could form this kind of deal. The question whether the Israeli public and the Palestinian public are ready for this remains to be seen.
Linda, do the Israeli people still have confidence in Benjamin Netanyahu? I mean, you spoke about you not having any confidence. I mean, you think it's a mistake that he's not talking about what happens in post-war Gaza. Are they still confident, of his
no
capacity,
not
capabilities at this time?
In fact, the polls show that only about 15% of the public has confidence in him. And there are more and more demonstrations that are starting to gain strength to go to an early election. Not necessarily right now, but as soon as the war ends, whatever that means, and for there to be elections. The other possibility is that Netanyahu's Likud party could decide to replace him. And that's also being talked about. But people do not have confidence in him. Unlike the military establishment, they do have confidence still in the army, but they do not have confidence in Netanyahu. And unlike the intelligence officials and the chief of staff, who have taken responsibility and said we made mistakes. And the fact that October 7th happened and that Hamas kind of was able to come in and take over more than 20 communities in Israel near the border with Gaza, and that it took, in some cases, 2 days for Israel to take back those communities, and citizens were hiding in their safe rooms, and the entire country is kind of traumatized, and Netanyahu has consistently refused to take responsibility. And I think people are angry, and I think, at least according to the polls and analysts that I've spoken to, they feel that this is the end of Netanyahu's very long career. He's the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, but that he will not be able to survive the aftermath of the war.
Wow. Linda, thank you again for your reporting and analysis on the world today. Appreciate you joining us today, and do stay safe in Israel.
Thank you. Thank you.